Good morning, YouTubers. Today I'm going to discuss a piece of technology that is synonymous with the 1980s, Betamax. If you're too young to even remember VHS growing up, then Betamax is likely to be even more foreign to you. Betamax was the runner-up in a two-way race for home video dominance. Despite losing out on being the industry standard for home consumers, Betamax actually remained the industry standard for professionals, especially television stations, well into the 2000s. But what exactly was Betamax and why did it lose out to VHS? For that answer, we have to travel all the way back to mid-1940s Japan.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. We are now prepared to destroy, more rapidly and completely, every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city. We shall destroy their docks, their factories, and their communications. Let there be no mistake. We shall completely destroy Japan's power to make war. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware.
A war which had entered its 8th terrible year in China, which had raged for 3 years and 9 months for America and Britain, which was the brutal, costly eastern half of the most horrible worldwide war in human history, is now within minutes of ending for good. The surrender documents by which Japan agrees to lay down arms completely and to obey all Allied orders issued by General MacArthur were printed by the Army on rare parchment found in a basement in ravaged Manila.
In post-World War II Japan, their nation's infrastructure demanded rebuilding, as did much of the Eastern world at that time. One industry post-war Japan began focusing on was electronics. It was a logical industry for a nation in their position to begin investing in. Electronics didn't pose a threat to international security and peace, plus it was an industry expected to dramatically grow in the coming years, therefore making it highly profitable. In May of 1946, engineer Masaru Ibuka opened an electronics shop in Tokyo in hopes of contributing to his native country's rebuilding. Soon after opening, Akio Morita, a physicist, joined Ibuka, and the duo, along with 8 employees, formed Tokyo Shishinen Kagyo, translated to Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation, with the intention of manufacturing telephones and amplified megaphones. Morita had been born to a wealthy family living in Nagawa, Japan in 1921. His father was the president of a sake brewery and had high hopes for his son to continue in this tradition by succeeding him as head of the company. But the younger Morita had different hopes and dreams. Throughout his life, he had been exposed to numerous luxuries that most Japanese families at the time didn't have access to. One such luxury was a phonograph. It's reported that his fascination with his family's phonograph is what caused him to start building his own electronic devices while still in high school, items that included his own phonograph and a radio receiver. As World War II began, Morita began studying physics at Osaka Imperial University. Having more of a taste for technology and science rather than war and combat, Morita enlisted in the Imperial Navy as a researcher with the intention of avoiding combat, but it wasn't done in a cowardly manner. He just felt his talents best served the Emperor as a researcher rather than a soldier. One of the projects Morita worked on involved developing heat-seeking weapons. It was during this period that Morita would actually meet Ibuka for the first time. Through mutual interests, a friendship had been formed, despite the 13-year age difference between the two. Having high ambitions for their success, Ibuka Morita began developing several products outside of telephones and megaphones, including Japan's first tape recorder in 1950. It was a reel-to-reel which they dubbed the Type G. The G implied it was designed for government use and was widely used in courtrooms and offices. A year later, in 1951, they released the Type H, intended for home use. 3 years later, in 1954, they became Japan's first licensee to manufacture transistors, a new technology at the time that would revolutionize everything from radios to televisions to computers by acting as a predecessor to the microprocessor. Ibuka and Morita both realized the potential growth their young company could develop into, and in an effort to appeal to English-speaking consumers, felt a name change was necessary. Initially, they considered using the company's initials, TDK. However, the railway company Tokyo Kauko beat them to the punch. Tatsuko had been an acronym used by employees, but it was soon discovered that most Americans had trouble pronouncing it, which is why I probably mispronounced it just now. Eventually, they agreed on the name Sony, a mixture of sonus, the Latin word for sonic and sound, and the Japanese slang term sunny, which was used in reference to smart and respectable young men. While the Sony branding began to appear in advertising as early as 1955, it didn't become the official company name until early 1958. One interesting thing to note is that unlike most other companies in Japan at the time, they didn't include their respective industry in the company name. They just kept it simply Sony. Another thing to note is also unlike other Japanese companies at the time, they made their official company name using Roman letters as opposed to kanji. But Ibuka and Morita had international ambitions for Sony, so appealing to English-speaking nations was key to securing their success in those markets. In December of 1957, just 1 month before Sony officially adopted their marketing brand as their company name, Sony released the TR-63 to the American public. The TR-63 was a pocket-sized transistor radio that quickly became quite popular among Western consumers. Wanting to expand their presence in the United States, Morita founded Sony Corporation of America in 1960. While doing so, Morita became a keen observer of American customs. One observation Morita made was the seemingly casual manner of people leaving one company to work for another one. This concept was unheard of in Japan. For a nation who remained reluctant to surrender in war, leaving your longtime employer to join their rival was not considered honorable. But Morita saw this uniquely American tactic as the most profitable means of doing business back home in Japan. Upon returning, he began approaching experienced workers of rival companies and enticing them to join Sony. Little did anyone realize that breaking the loyalty tradition was just another wall that Sony as a company and Japan as a nation were breaking down while inadvertently reinventing their culture and redefining their role in the world. This was a new Japan, whose emperors were now replaced with corporate CEOs, and whose samurai warriors were now replaced with engineers who didn't wield swords, but instead soldering irons. While not one of the first 8 employees to work at what would eventually be Sony, a young recent college grad named Nobutashi Kahara began working at Tokyo Telecommunications Engineering Corporation in 1947. Throughout the 1950s, Kahara had established a reputation while helping build some of Sony's earliest products. By 1964, he was leading a team of engineers that were tasked by Ibuka with designing and building a tape recorder that worked similarly to their reel-to-reel recorder. The major difference that Ibuka wanted Kahara to add was the ability to record both video and audio with the intention of being able to play it back in sync. Kahara reportedly grumbled at his team's new assignment, but Kahara's school, a nickname given to Sony's second development division, got to work on what many thought was too difficult a task to actually complete. Kahara had first-hand experience with developing Sony's magnetic recording technology, so he seemed like a logical choice to lead the team that would eventually build a videotape recorder. With the help of engineers Akane Horiuchi and Yashimi Watabe, the team agreed that using the same type of magnetic tape technology was the first step for this new device. At the time, the most common means of recording video involved a gamma iron tape, but the low density provided by this type of tape did not have a high enough quality to satisfy them. The solution came in the form of a chrome oxidized tape from their Sendai factory. The way information is transmitted to the tape involves the tape head revolving in the opposite direction the tape is being fed through and at a high speed. Magnets inside the head serve as the means electronic information is transferred from tape head to tape. The safe space inside the tape, the reels were placed slightly overlapping each other, as opposed to the side-by-side method commonly used in their audio recording tapes. With ease of use in mind, the team designed an automatic loading system that would be easy on the tape when the magnetic head was reading it. Because of this U-shaped loading system, the team named it the U-loading system. The U-loading system was designed to minimize the tension placed on the tape when it was in use either for recording or playback. The final major challenge involved allowing colors to be recorded on the tape. To rectify this, the team used a frequency modulator designed by Toshihiko Numikara. While previous color recording systems had been developed for tape, such as the YC signal separation system, those devices recorded color and luminance on separate tracks. The Numikara patent, or the color under system, recorded color and luminance on the same track. In the end, they had a design that recorded video and audio on a 7-inch reel tape encased in a cassette tape. After being shown a demonstration of the new U-matic tape deck, Abuko responded in what many describe as typical Abuko tradition. "So you've managed to build this marvelous machine. Just think, the next one will be even better." This mentality of congratulating his team on a project, while at the same time telling them to think of the next generation of this technology, was very typical of Abuko. Not long after the U-matic was completed in October of 1969, Kohara was tasked with building a smaller, better videotape recorder. After it was released to the public in September of 1971, the U-matic was intended for home consumer use, but soon proved too large and too expensive for anyone other than major television stations and other professionals involved in television production. Although it wasn't until 1974, with Sony's first portable VTR, the VO3800, that television broadcasters began really adapting their studios and newsrooms to utilize the format. Prior to the VO3800, news reporters in the field resorted to using 16mm film to capture news footage. In this new era of electronic news gathering, news stations everywhere were able to deliver breaking news footage in record time, instead of being held hostage by the time it took to develop and prepare film for their broadcasts. In an attempt to improve upon the technology, Sony engineers Fumio Kono and Akio Serizawa led the team that designed the electronic and mechanical aspects of this new VTR machine. This team had both the fast forward and a rewind feature that could be enabled while the tape was loaded, something the original model could not. They also increased the tape loading density. During the development of these new features, Kohara was able to execute an idea that increased the recording density threefold. They did so by developing what they called the azimuth recording system. This new method involved angling one of the recording heads differently from the other recording head in an attempt to prevent crosstalk from occurring on the tape. Crosstalk is simply what happens when a transmitted signal on one channel creates an effect on another channel. This occurrence would easily happen if recording tape heads were aligned together, but if you angle one of the heads differently from the other, then the data being recorded on bands like this doesn't interfere with data on adjacent bands. When the tape heads are flat, a guard band or blank band is necessary to properly separate the information on the various bands. But when recorded at an angle and played back at that same angle, the device can clearly see where one band ends and the next one begins because they're at angles like this. If you've ever seen your VCR show this tracking feature on screen, that's what it's doing, finding the right angle to play back the tape. It's this azimuth recording system that became standard in all VTRs from the mid-1970s until the technology's end of life in the 21st century. To resolve another issue regarding color signal crosstalk at low frequencies, they developed what they called the New Color System, or PI system, which served as a phase change color system. Translating that into layman's terms is not easy, but essentially what happens is the tape, all being fed through both VTR heads, records video signals at these angles shown. The chroma signal fed to the other head is delayed by 90 degrees, recording video signals thusly. During playback, the first head indicates a large signal from its own track, as well as a smaller crosstalk signal from the adjacent tracks being laid down by the other head. To output the desired signal to the monitor, the output phase is advanced by 90 degrees. By 1973, Sony had produced several prototypes of home consumer VTRs. Around the same time, Kono and his team were moved from 2nd Development Division and relocated to the Betamax Research and Development Group. Their first goal was to prepare the production facilities for manufacturing these new VTRs. This new VTR used a tape format that was 2/3 the weight of the U-matic, and the tapes themselves used only half of the number of parts as the U-matic tape format. While color televisions had already been introduced into most American homes by this time, the Japanese were just now beginning to keep up with the Joneses. The machine that Kohara had been calling azimuth recording was now officially being marketed as Betamax. Beta being the Japanese word used to describe the method these electronic signals are transferred onto the tape, and max being the abbreviated English word for maximum. Sony's mentality of marketing products with the Western world in mind, before these products were even assembled, just goes to show how high their ambitions were for turning not just themselves, but Japan as a whole, into the world leader of electronics. Oh, just a quick note. Whenever I refer to VTR or video tape recorder, as opposed to VCR or video cassette recorder, I tend to use the term VTR out of habit. VTR refers to any tape format, whereas VCR refers to a very specific tape format. In an era now where Western consumers have the ability to digitally record programs on their DVR or stream anything, you have to realize that in the mid-1970s, this idea of watching what you want when you want just did not exist. And I know there was an entire generation baffled at that concept, because I've seen the look on a kid's face when you tell them that program is not available to watch right now. They respond with, "What do you mean? How is it not available?" It's the same generation that scratches their heads when you describe what Saturday morning cartoons were. So if you're young enough to be placed in that group, just try to imagine no internet, no streaming, no DVR, no tablets, just 3 channels broadcasted over the airways. Well, 4 if you count PBS. And who doesn't love Mr. Rogers and Sesame Street? If you wanted to watch something, you had to tune in at the actual time of the broadcast.
No, sir, I don't think I have any use for rubber nipples. But I'll tell you what, though. Do you have any rubber walrus protectors? Call the police.
During the 1960s and going into the 70s, color televisions began entering into American homes, and people generally thought it couldn't get any better. Although, to be honest, does anyone really think the color episodes of Andy Griffith are better than the original black and white ones? On May 10, 1975, Sony released to the Japanese market the SL6300 VCR deck and the LV1801, which is just a TV VCR unit that combined the SL6300 with an 18-inch color television. Both of these were the first Betamax VTRs released. For only 60% of the cost of Sony's own U-matic VTR, or 229,800 yen, you could purchase this new VCR unit. Adjusted for inflation, that's approximately 433,522 yen in 2018. With the currency exchange rates, that's roughly $880 in 1975, or $4,100 in 2018. The LV1801 combo unit was priced at 449,800 yen in 1975, or about 849,000 yen in 2018. In US dollars, that's approximately $4,300 in 1975, or about 8,000 in 2018. A single blank tape with a 60-minute runtime cost 4,500 yen, or about $80 in 1975. That's about 8,500 yen, or approximately $375 in 2018. While Japan had undergone a bit of a Western transformation, such as incorporating Western ideals like hiring workers from competing companies, one aspect that remained strictly Japanese was their value of trust among fellow competitors. In 1976, this ideal of trust would be betrayed and start a war between companies that wouldn't be resolved for nearly a decade. 2 years prior to this war and just a year prior to the Betamax's debut, Sony had sought Victor Company of Japan and Matsushita in 1974 with the idea of developing a common, unified VTR format. Victor Company of Japan is probably best known by their initials, JVC. Both JVC and Matsushita had remained silent on the idea of cooperating with Sony to develop a common VTR format, and it wouldn't be until 1976 for Sony to realize why. In September of 1976, to the shock and horror of Sony, JVC released their own VTR format, which they simply dubbed VHS. And while Betamax and VHS are both very similar to each other in terms of design and function, VHS was different enough that it was not at all compatible with Betamax. Upon close examination of this new VHS VTR, Sony saw that JVC had taken full advantage of these prior meetings with them to utilize Sony's proprietary and patented technology to develop this new VHS format. Sony barely had an opportunity to even get their Betamax technology out to the public when they found themselves in a battle for supremacy in this new market. One appealing quality VHS offered consumers was the ability to record twice as much video on a single tape. In order for them to even do this, they had to sacrifice video quality. When compared side by side, Betamax clearly has a better quality video picture. But that didn't mean VHS had poor video quality itself, it just didn't look as good. For many consumers just concerned with price, sacrificing a little video quality was well worth saving money on this new technology. Matsushita, who had also been part of these 1974 meetings and had failed to take advantage of the opportunity like JVC had, was now in a position where they were forced to pick a side. At Matsushita's main office in Osaka, Japan, Morita and Kahara from Sony visited Matsushita advisor Kanosuke Matsushita and laid out their case for working together to defeat JVC. In the end, Kanosuke Matsushita said, "It pains me to have to reject Betamax, but the JVC product has fewer components. My company must choose the product that can be manufactured more cheaply, whether by 100 yen or 1,000 yen per unit, as the only way to overcome the disadvantage of being a latecomer." And so it had begun. A line had been drawn in the sand and companies started taking sides. But Sony was hardly alone in this fight. Pioneer, Iowa, Sanyo Electric, NEC, and Sony Toshiba had all joined Sony's side for manufacturing Betamax. To join JVC on the VHS side, Hitachi, Sharp, Aikai Electric, and Mitsubishi Electric began fighting on behalf of VHS. Some may want to compare this to the alliances formed in World War II. But unlike World War II and more like an alien invasion from outer space, movie studio Universal Pictures also got caught in the mix, but not as an ally of either side. Instead, they entered as a foe to both, determined to shut down everything either side was fighting for. In 1976, Universal filed suit in the United States court system, claiming copyright infringement. They charged that these new VTRs contributed to the illegal distribution of television programs and films. With war on all fronts, the real-life World War II veterans who founded and built Sony would put everything on the line in order to taste victory, something they had failed to do 3 decades earlier in 1945. While all this was occurring, both Sony and JVC began trying to improve their respective technologies in an effort to take any advantage in the marketplace. Sony's first logical step was to develop a 2-hour Betamax tape to compete with JVC's 2-hour VHS tape. JVC began the logical attempt to improve VHS's picture quality. In the middle of Sony's war against VHS, they were about to win a major battle that ultimately would benefit all VTR manufacturers. On January 17, 1984, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of Sony in their lawsuit brought by Universal Pictures regarding copyright infringement. The court ruled that video recording devices do not infringe on anyone's copyrights and are actually considered fair use. With his victory in the court system, a new industry would soon open up and become a contributing factor in the war of VHS versus Betamax, the home video market. For those born after this time, it's hard to imagine a time when you weren't able to enjoy your favorite films in the comfort of your own home, at least not without the liberty to view them anytime. 1983 witnessed the introduction of the video rental store. At the time, stores supplied both VHS and Betamax. However, within a few years, it was becoming clear that consumers were choosing VHS over its Betamax rival. Sales figures for both machines and tapes in each format were beginning to illustrate a trend. By the time the U.S. Supreme Court issued its ruling in 1984, Sony Betamax allies Toshiba, Sanyo, and NEC began losing faith in the technology and started looking for lifeboats by beginning to sell both Betamax and VHS formats. In their response, Sony pumped up their advertising campaign, releasing not just more advertising, but more aggressive experimental advertising. The most notable being a 4-day sweep of print ads that ran in major newspapers circulated throughout Japan starting on January 25, 1984. These series of ads were unique because the first 3 days ads featured headlines questioning the future of Betamax, followed by the 4th and final day's headline reading, "Betamax, getting more and more exciting all the time." While these ads did boost sales of Betamax shortly after, long-term, perhaps the first 3 days worth of ads questioning the death of Betamax were appropriate foreshadowing. According to Fortune magazine, by the end of 1984, Sony only captured less than 7% of the VTR market, down from 13% 2 years prior. At that same time in 1984, Matsushita led the industry with a whopping 19% of the market share. By the beginning of 1985, Sony had yet to gain a leverage against JVC or any VHS manufacturer. Many of their own allies had already begun producing both Betamax and VHS machines and products. Things were not going well for Sony in the Betamax war, and it wouldn't be long before Sony themselves realized this. In terms of the lack of success Sony was facing with Betamax, Japan was just the tip of the iceberg. An iceberg most of their former Betamax allies had long since detected before producing both Betamax and its arch-rival VHS. When it came to the American market, Sony just didn't understand the American mentality of bigger means more means better. While many Americans realized Betamax was in fact better quality, most didn't care. A recordable machine that could capture an entire 4-hour football game? Sign me up! VHS, while obviously a lesser quality technology, still made more financial sense for most Americans. That was something Sony never fully understood at the time. Unlike their VHS competitors, Sony failed to add simple features to their Betamax. Features that became commonplace with VHS recorders included a pause while recording button or even a timer for automatic recordings. I can appreciate Sony's commitment to continuing to push Betamax over VHS. When compared to VHS, Betamax performed better and had some obvious quality advantages. However, VHS had its own advantages too, and it would be those advantages that appealed to most consumers. Yes, Betamax may have a better picture, but if you're watching on a 13-inch set, who cares? Picture quality takes a back seat over other features that Sony just wasn't offering. Throughout 1986 and 87, Sony continued to push their Betamax format to consumers. However, they're still a business, and like all businesses, a tough decision needed to be made in order to keep the company from relying on other electronic ventures they had, such as the Walkman. In April of 1987, JVC delivered what was the atomic bomb of the Betamax war when they introduced their new, higher quality S-VHS format. This format works similar to VHS, but one of the differences includes an increased bandwidth of 5.4 MHz from VHS's 3.4 MHz in luminance carrier. This improved the picture quality significantly by giving a horizontal resolution of 420 vertical lines per picture height compared to the 240 lines that make up a VHS picture. JVC had originally hoped that S-VHS would replace VHS, but ironically, it was for the same reasons Betamax was failing that caused most consumers to simply ignore S-VHS. Throughout the late 1980s and 90s, S-VHS was a staple amongst local television news crews and small production studios, as was Betamax as well.
If you own a Beta format VCR, you may have noticed that it's become increasingly difficult to buy or rent pre-recorded product on that format. The maker of the Beta machine has noticed as well, and now Sony will market hardware in VHS for the first time.
In January of 1988, Sony conceded in the Betamax war when they announced that they too would finally begin manufacturing VHS machines and tapes. This didn't mean they would cease the production of Betamax equipment, just that the facilities would add the VHS format to their production line. No doubt Masaru Ibuka and Yukio Morita must have felt that despite all their success of building Sony into the global powerhouse that it was then and continues to be today, that they had failed their company by allowing JVC to dominate the industry with an inferior alternative to their own creation. There's probably a handful of you watching this wondering why the stupid bald bearded guy didn't even mention the V2000 tape format at all. Here's why. Most of you have probably never even heard of the V2000 tape format. If you have, good for you, you get a cookie. In 1979, Philips released a third type of videotape format they called Video 2000. Now, before you V2000 enthusiasts want to compare this to the ColecoVision competing against the Atari 2600 and the Intellivision, let me just burst that bubble you've created around the V2000. There are several reasons why I don't even consider V2000 even worth mentioning. First off, when the ColecoVision entered the video game market as late as they did, they had several things going for them at the time. One was an exclusive right to Donkey Kong. Another was that used superior hardware that created better graphics than either the 2600 or the Intellivision. V2000 wasn't a superior tape format. Not to mention they didn't even develop the format for NTSC, which limited the release to just markets that used the PAL or CCAM television signal. They're showing up fashionably late to the party, and then they're showing up the next morning after everyone's woken up with a hangover. V2000 showed up the next morning.
Don't be that guy.
Philips wanted the V2000 to be utilized in the same way the XFL wanted to be a legitimate sports league.
the XFL.
Hey, he's on me! He's alive! He's grabbing my arm! Oh! He was alive! No, it was just a bad dream. Fellas! Ah! Now that was a f***ing boat ride! Whoa! An adventure like that makes me frickin' horny!
My final thought on the V2000 is that it was an inferior tape format released way too late to a limited market. Rosario Ibuka continued to remain close to the Sony board, serving as an advisor until his death in 1997 from heart failure at the age of 89. During a game of tennis in 1993, Akio Morita suffered a non-fatal stroke. On November 25, 1994, Morita officially stepped down as Sony chairman. 5 years later, in October of 1999, he contracted pneumonia and passed away at the age of 78. Not long after Sony began manufacturing VHS equipment in 1988, Nobutoshi Kahara became a mentor for many future engineers after establishing the Sony Kahara Research Center with cooperation from Sony. Kahara finally had an established classroom to pass on and teach the future generations of engineers and served as its president until retiring in 2006. Throughout his 60 years working at Sony, Kahara worked on numerous other projects besides Betamax. He had a big hand in designing and developing Sony's line of camcorders, stereos, and even a little-known device called the Walkman. On February 13, 2011, Nobutoshi Kahara died of heart failure at the age of 84. What impact does Sony Betamax have on the electronics industry? A pretty significant one. While many consider Betamax to be a failed product, it was in fact anything but. Comparing Betamax to its chief rival format VHS, Betamax clearly had better video quality overall. While the S-VHS format, introduced in 1987, was used in many local television stations across the United States, Betamax was used by even more and for a much longer time period. While I'm not sure if this is more sad on my former employer's end or more of a testament to Betamax, I can personally vouch that the Betamax format was still being used in local news stations in the United States until as late as 2008. And the high-definition Betamax tape format was still being used by national television stations for storage purposes only until at least 2012. With Betamax's superior quality and longevity being said, JVC was able to conquer the home consumer market with an inferior product because they understood consumers cared more about cost and convenience over quality, especially in the United States. About a decade ago, there was a similar battle between HD DVD and Blu-ray. In an ironic tale, Blu-ray, a technologically superior format, ended up defeating HD DVD to take the place as the standard high-definition home video format. What's ironic about Blu-ray is that Sony was the company that actually produced the first Blu-ray players when they released their first prototypes in October of 2000. When someone mentions Betamax as a failure, I can't help but think of how many times and how many Betamax tapes I would see on a tape card ready to be used as B-roll and sound bites for the local news day in and day out. No doubt those at Sony who helped bring Betamax to the public must have felt like they'd failed. And since most of those people were also World War II veterans who fought on the Imperial Japanese side, I can appreciate how these same people refused to accept defeat until they had no choice. Both Betamax and S-VHS serve as a reminder that in the business side of technology, better quality doesn't necessarily mean it'll be more successful. Balancing quality with consumer preference is a tightrope. Well, that is it for this episode of The Bearded Nerd. Thanks for watching. Be sure to click the thumbs up if you liked the video and to subscribe to keep up with future videos. See you next time.
My name is Cliff, brother of Joe. I got me some crack. I want me some hoes. Let me hear you say yeah. Yeah. Let me hear you say yeah.
Yeah.
Let me hear you say yeah.